All right, folks, I'm going to get started. All right, so there's like this issue with the textbook. Apparently, the bookstore ordered the wrong book. I emailed my department about it. I'm going to wait to hear back from them. Do not buy the book from the textbook from the bookstore. If you already bought it, return it. If you've opened it, I'm going to try to find out what your options are. They should ultimately, hopefully, take it back. I'll figure this out. I'll email as soon as I have any information on this. So just stay away from the textbook stuff. Click on the link in the syllabus, buy the digital access, and just go down that route. That's the best. That's the best. Actually, no. If go with the trial access first, if you want to buy the hard copy, because you might end up wanting to buy the bundled option with the Launchpad access and the hardcover that they may eventually have at the bookstore, or maybe you could get it elsewhere. So if you actually do want to buy a brand new book, then just go for the 21-day trial period. If you just want access to the digital book and maybe are going to get a cheap book online, just go to the link in the syllabus and buy that access directly from Launchpad. Was there a question over here? Saw a hand up. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry about this. I don't know what the problem is. I don't know why they ordered this book. I'm going to try to figure this out, and hopefully it'll all get worked out. And no, it won't be too painful, but it's already painful. It's just a good thing never to buy your book or anything before you come to class and find out exactly what you need from the professor. That's just kind of a good rule of thumb. And definitely, like, just don't buy stuff that you can't return and open it before you get confirmation that everything's fine. Even though generally you would think that it would be, but anyway. Cautionary tale, folks. All right, any questions about all that stuff? Again, I will let you know as soon as I know anything. I email my department, so they should get back to me tomorrow and try to figure it out. All right, let's jump into the actual reason why we're here, which is to learn economics. So we're going to cover the first principles, which is chapter 1. All economic analysis is based on these 12 principles that we're going to cover. They apply to many different issues. So what we'll learn is a set of principles that have to do specifically with how individuals make choices. And then we're going to look at a set of principles that have to do with how the interaction of individual choices might result in one outcome or another. And then finally, we'll look at a set of principles for understanding economy-wide interaction. So the first 8 principles, the first 2 sets of principles here are going to be sort of micro-based, but even in the macro class, there's still concepts that are reliant on micro concepts. So that's why both classes kind of start the same way and then kind of go off on their own sort of tangents. So that's why initially we do kind of cover some micro concepts. So that's why some of the principles we'll cover are specifically micro, and then the last ones will be all macro. So just formally, an economy defined by our textbook is a system for coordinating society's productive activities. So producing, and then consuming, and then of course the distribution of what's produced for consumption. Economics itself is a social science that studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. So pay close attention to the social part of the science label. It is a social science. It is not like a natural science like physics and chemistry and biology, where you can clearly look at a system and you can clearly measure everything, and everything that you understand the system to be will get you to sort of predictions about other things that could happen. So that's why you can model how planets are made, and then you can kind of figure out, well, how long was it for the Earth? How long has the Earth been around? And what conditions lead to the creation of planets and moons and solar systems and etc. It has to do with gravity. It has to do with this, that, and the other. All these forces that are there, that are clearly observable, that are then predictable. Economics is different. We want to be like the natural sciences. We want to have that kind of respect in the scientific fields. But there's a problem, and the problem is us, humans. We are what make up an economy, and humans are not predictable. Like, we have what are called animal spirits, which is what John Maynard Keynes, a big macroeconomist guy, called the part of us that's just kind of like an animal. Yeah, we've got like this logical part to us, but that coexists with this animal side, like where like emotions kind of drive our behavior, and because of that, it's just difficult to be able to say, well, we have a whole system called the economy. It functions like this, and we can clearly predict what it's going to do. Like, obviously, we cannot predict what it's going to do. Sometimes the economy is just thrown into tailspins that lead the world into like really severe ups and downs that affect all of our lives. And that has everything to do with the animal spirits, right? The part of us that's uncontrollable, that's unstable, that will like have like knee-jerk reactions and not always do what is most logical. And that's why we get these like big sort of turbulent periods where like it's uncertain what's going to happen. So like right now you've got like the whole Brexit thing, and then everybody's wondering what happens if Donald Trump gets nominated to be president. If he gets elected to be president, then who knows what he's going to do? Like nobody knows. Like nobody knows how he's going to behave with the rest of the world. What's going to happen with all the trade pacts that we have throughout the entire world that have created like some order within our economy. Like that uncertainty causes like investors to behave in weird ways, like ways that are unpredictable, and thus making the economy like what it's going to happen like just completely unpredictable. So we like recently there was a study done that showed that I think somewhere like 1% of the world population I think has like 50% of the world's wealth. That's a lot of power in such a small amount of hands, and that's one of the reasons why like we have such a turbulent world economy, because you have these people that have so much power, and the decisions they make with respect to how much they want to invest or pull back from investing affects everybody, affects the entire economy. And again, their reactions are knee-jerk. Their reactions are based on what these animal spirits, and therefore it makes our discipline, economics, just more complicated than the natural sciences, because we have to take into account that unpredictability. And how we do that is by incorporating probability into our models, which then allows us to say, well, with this much probability, this could happen. With this much probability, this could happen. But we can't say concretely that this will happen if we do A, B, and C. And so because of that, we are a social science. And so if you get a degree in economics, it's considered a degree in arts rather than science. So you have like a Bachelor of Arts in economics rather than a Bachelor of Science. Like my PhD is an art PhD, not a science PhD, even though we use a lot of the tools that most natural sciences use. So that's just something to keep in mind. And it's something that and something to be aware of with respect to like what economists try to sort of relay to people. Most economists will always say, yes, there is uncertainty with respect to what we do, and so what we're saying is sort of an idea of what's going to happen, but not exactly what's going to happen. But there will be some economists that will say, no, we are right, and this is how things work, and if you do A, B, and C, it will lead to E, no doubt. And those people are delusional and dangerous. But some of them are in powerful positions, and so you always have to be conscious of like what's being said to you and who's saying it to you. So just know that economists in general, the ones that you should be listening to are the ones that acknowledge that what they're saying is not concrete and that there is uncertainty with respect to what's going to happen and what they're saying. All right, so let's talk about a market economy. A market economy is an economy in which decisions about production and consumption are made by individual producers and consumers. That is in contrast to what's called a command economy, in which there's a central authority making decisions about production and consumption. So just going back over the last century, like in the Soviet Union, you had a communist state from 1917 through 1991 when the wall fell, and sort of the communist state fell apart. And since that time, we've kind of, on a global level, been like this like market economy sort of driven system. In a command economy, the government tries to basically control the entire economy and say, well, we're going to produce this much stuff, and this is how it's going to get to people, and this is what people are going to consume. The purpose of that is to try to take care of as many people as possible. So there's good intentions there, and that's great. And I hope that maybe someday somebody can come up with that kind of a system that actually works. But the problem with that kind of system is the problem with any system in this world, and that is human error. You have people in the world that have egos, and they want power. And so even in a system that tries to control things for the benefit of everybody, you're going to get people at the top that are going to be corrupt, and they're going to make the system work for them and not everybody. And so things are going to fall apart. In the Soviet Union, what you wound up having is just a lot of things that were being produced and that people didn't need. There were lines for food because there wasn't enough food to go around. That's just the sort of economy that you could potentially have if a government tries to completely control the economy. In a market economy, the decisions about what's going to be produced, what people are going to consume, and how these things are going to be distributed to people are made by individual producers and consumers. All right, so market economies are able to coordinate even highly complex activities and to reliably provide consumers with goods and services that they want. The unplanned chaos, in quotes, of a market economy turns out to be far more orderly than the planning of a market economy. And the chaos reflects the idea that there isn't a central authority kind of coordinating the whole thing. But in this weird way, the market economy actually winds up coordinating itself. And what winds up doing that is what this economist named Adam Smith termed the invisible hand. It refers to the way in which the individual pursuit of self-interest can lead to good results for society as a whole. So if everybody in the society is looking out for themselves, then that winds up in a weird way coordinating all of the productive resources so that everybody who wants things can get them, and things that are being produced are going to people that want them. So in 1776, in a famous passage in his book, The Wealth of Nations, the pioneering Scottish economist Adam Smith wrote about how individuals, in pursuing their own interests, often end up serving the interests of society as a whole. So this book was the first book that anybody ever sat down and wrote that kind of summed everything up with respect to how these individual decisions can then coordinate into an economy and how all that can then work. And so what he effectively did with this book was to create the discipline of microeconomics. It's the first book that people considered to be a textbook for microeconomics. Don't read the book. It's extremely dry and it's super thick. He's so detailed about the most minute, unimportant details, seemingly unimportant, but ultimately it winds up being such a powerful book, and it has played such an important role both in the discipline and in our world. But this whole thing of the invisible hand is something that's often cited by people that are pure free market economy thinkers that are the government should never play a role in the economy because the invisible hand will take care of it. And Adam Smith never really meant that to be the case. He just meant to sort of highlight the nature of the way that things get coordinated, but he never tried to say that it was a perfect system and that there's absolutely no role for the government. And so we'll talk more about the fact that there is a role for government in this course, and as well as today as we move forward. So microeconomics, formally defined, is the branch of economics that studies how people make decisions and how these decisions interact. So just a side note, as far as what you should be paying attention to, the things you should be paying attention to in this class is sort of like the things you would pay attention to in a math course, where you learn technical information and then you learn to apply that information. So if I'm talking about something that happened in 1776 and some book that was written, that's just meant to give you insights into the concepts that you need to learn in order to be able to apply them. It's just meant to give you context so that maybe hopefully you absorb it a little bit better. But this is not a history course. I'm not going to ask you what happened in 1776. What was the name of that book? I'm never going to do silly things like that. But I would want you to understand what microeconomics is, what the invisible hand is, what macroeconomics is, and then of course ultimately what the models are that we're going to be looking at, how they work, why they work the way they do, and ask you to apply them to different situations. So again, this is more, you have to think of this class more of kind of a math course, math technical type of course, where you learn certain tools, you figure out how they work, and then you apply them. So I'm going to talk a lot about stuff that may not be on the slides. Don't worry about knowing that stuff for exams. Focus on the terms, focus on the diagrams, focus on the models. All right, now, as like I said, like this is not a perfect system. The invisible hand is not always our friend. It's important to understand when and why individual pursuit of self-interest can lead to counterproductive behavior. So even though like that, the invisible hand, like this inclination of people to kind of look out for their best interest by like buying the things they want or producing the things that will make them money, even though that does ultimately coordinate the economy way better than a command economy, just given historical uh, uh, precedent, like it's not perfect. So we have what's called market failure when the market does not work, when the invisible hand does not um, properly sort of coordinate the system so that it's as efficient as possible. So when the individual pursuit of self-interest leads to bad results for society as a whole, we have what's called market failure. Examples include air pollution and water pollution, as well as the overexploitation of natural resources such as fish and forests. You have companies that are like, I'm going to make as much money as possible, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should try to make as much money as possible. But if you're just going to be like throwing all your waste into the local rivers, polluting that, over farming lands to the point where they're no longer going to be farmable, that kind of thing, like you're hurting everybody in that case. And obviously, government then needs to step in and say, well, wait a minute, we need to regulate this. We need to put some checks on this like invisible hand process that is helping society, but obviously can hurt it. So we need to kind of balance that. So there is a role in government in a market economy. Economic analysis can often be used to devise solutions for these problems, and that's part of what we do in economics. Now, as we know, there are good times and bad times in the economy. The economy does not always run smoothly. It experiences fluctuations, a series of ups and downs. So a recession is what we term a downturn in the economy. You've heard of recessions. We were in what was called the Great Recession, post 2008, when we had a big banking crisis, which we'll talk more about as the semester goes forward. Fortunately, we're out of that, but that's one example of a recession. Like market failure, recessions are a fact of life, and they are a problem for which economic analysis offers some solutions. Recessions are one of the main concerns of the branch of economics known as macroeconomics, and that's what we're studying in this course, the branch of economics that is concerned with the overall ups and downs in the economy. So that's a big topic that we'll be talking about as we go further beyond like the third chapter we'll cover. All right, so at the beginning of the 20th century, most Americans lived under conditions that we would now think of as extreme poverty. Only 10% of homes had flushing toilets, 8% had central heating, only 2% had electricity, and almost nobody had a car, let alone a washing machine or air conditioning. So such comparisons are stark reminders of how much our lives have been changed by what we call economic growth. Economic growth is the growing ability of the economy to produce goods and services. So because of technological revolutions that occurred during the Industrial Revolution period, in which there were major advancements in steam power at first, and then electric power, the internal combustion engine, like these things, like change the nature of our lives, change the nature of our ability to produce, and so it is what caused this like major economic growth that has changed our lives, made us into what everybody calls a developed country now, and is transforming like the developing world, China, India, and other countries into a society similar to our own. Like the advances that we enjoyed over the last couple of centuries, they can then use like obviously more rapidly because they can introduce them all at once. And that then leads to an accelerated growth rate beyond anything anybody's ever seen, and that's what we're seeing or have seen for the last few decades in like China and India. Now, one important thing to take away from this is this information here. Like, regardless of where you're at in your life and what you might think about the state of your life in relation to like what rich people have and all this silliness, like you have to remember, like 100 years prior to your existence, like people were living like this. 10% of homes had flush toilets. Like, I mean, it's so common for everybody to just have toilets, a couple in your house. Like, it's just a normal thing. But 100 years prior, like only rich people had toilets. Like super rich people had toilets. and nobody else did. Electricity, nobody had that. We didn't have antibiotics till like the middle of the last century. So the life expectancy was like in the mid 40s, and now it's like in the 80s. We just recently had another technological revolution, which is the digital revolution, and that's again changed the nature of our reality. These like super powerful computers that all of us have in our pockets, like if you go back 30 years, like the amount of processing power that is used in this would probably take up this entire room. I mean, things have dramatically changed, and we're only at like the beginning of this whole period. Like, who knows what all of you will see throughout your lifetime? I have a little less life left in me, but I have a feeling like I'm going to see some incredible things that may even just extend my life to places to a time that I never imagined. Like, I could actually live hundreds of years, and so could you. Who knows? Like, things are going to continue changing, and it's incredible. And we are very lucky to be alive at this moment in time. It's the most exciting time in human history. And that's something that you should always be thinking about. Like, we are living better than anyone's ever lived in the history of humanity. Any person that's ever been alive has never had it as good as we do right now. And when I say we, I'm talking about us. Like, just us regular people here in the valley in California. Like, we have it exceptionally well. And you just kind of need to remind yourself of that. It's good to strive for great things and all these other ideals that society sort of makes like like the targets for success. But it is also good to just immerse yourself in the knowledge that like what we have today is the incredible wealth of like 100 years ago. It's the kind of wealth that even the richest people back then couldn't even imagine. And so just appreciate that. Like it's important to appreciate that as much as possible, as often as possible. And even today, like you do have people throughout the world that are living without flush toilets, without electricity, without air conditioning, without washing machines. They exist. They're out there right this second doing whatever it is they need to survive. So we have a lot, and we're very fortunate people. So just remember that. All right, let's talk about these principles. The first set dealing specifically with individual choice. So individual choice is the decision by an individual of what to do, which necessarily involves a decision of what not to do. All economic activity involves individual choice. 4 economic principles underlie the economics of individual choice. One is that people must make choices because resources are scarce. There's not enough to go around, so choices must be made. 2, the opportunity cost of an item, what you must give up in order to get it, is its true cost. So when we model decision making in economics, we look at the decision to do something based on the cost and benefit of that. And the cost is defined in a very specific way. It's not the standard cost that everybody thinks about. It's not the kind of cost you would take into account in an accounting spreadsheet. It's slightly different than that, so we call it the opportunity cost, and that is the true cost of something, and we'll talk more about that in a second. A third principle: how much is a decision? How much decision? So if you're making a decision of how much to produce, how much to consume, that requires making trade-offs at the margin, at the edge of an activity. So comparing the costs and benefits of doing a little bit more of an activity versus doing a little bit less of an activity. So anytime we are thinking about decisions of how much to do things in economics, we're always doing marginal analysis. We're always at the point of production, at the point of consumption. I've produced this much. I've consumed this much. Should I produce one more? Should I consume one more? Marginal analysis. You look at the costs and benefits of doing that one more of an activity. Fourth principle, people usually respond to incentives, exploiting opportunities to make themselves better off. So let's consider each of these in turn. Choices are necessary because resources are scarce is the first one. A resource is anything that can be used to produce something else. So resources include things like land, labor, and capital. Capital includes goods like machines as well as human capital, which is education. So everything you're doing here is generating human capital for yourselves. Just the general term capital can also include like machines and like buildings. We're very specific about how we define things. So what you'll encounter in economics in general, in this class and in micro and in further classes you might take, is that you'll see words that you're familiar with and have sort of an intuition about what they mean. Now, you have to understand that like the way they're used in this class is it's a very specific way. It's a very formally defined way. So you might hear a word that you use on a regular basis. Don't depend on your own intuition to understand what that means. You have to learn the formal definition. Sometimes they'll coincide, often they will not. It's the same in any discipline. So when you're taking a bunch of other classes, anthropology, sociology, etc., that will happen a lot as well. Just always keep in mind that like you should be learning these new languages. It doesn't mean that what you already know about the world and your own intuition is wrong. It's okay to maintain those ideas, but you just kind of have to put everything in like a compartment in your mind so that you're able to say, well, when I need this particular type of information, economics, for instance, for an exam or maybe to apply it, I should be using this language, these definitions. But in colloquial, everyday interactions, you use the things that you use. You're what your intelligence reflecting that is valid, and there's nothing wrong with that. You should always be thinking critically though about what you're learning. Like you should always think about like where it's coming from, who's teaching it to you. Just don't take things at face value. Nothing that's being taught in this course is ever meant to change your mind about the way you think. Like you should always just kind of like accept what you're learning as just like a set of information that exists in this place in my world, and like I'm becoming aware of that, and I can have that in my head, but it doesn't have to change me. It doesn't have to make me into somebody else, unless you choose to let that happen, which is totally fine as well. That happened to me. But again, like you have to just be at peace and come to terms with the fact that like you have to like sometimes get away from like what you know and like kind of allow in other definitions. And that's what we do here. So, but again, like I said, some words will be familiar to you and will coincide with what you already know them to be, like scarce. If something's scarce, it's in short supply. It's pretty standard. The important idea behind scarcity is that it's not simply a question of the quantity available, but rather quantity available compared to how much is wanted or needed. So just it's relative. Like so right now, like water in general, it seems abundant and it's great and it's cheap. But it is actually ultimately scarce because our population is growing, the conditions on the earth are changing, and the projections seem to say that water is going to become a more rare resource as we move forward in time, and it's going to become more scarce. So there's going to have to be trade-offs made. There's going to have to be choices made with respect to how we're using water, definitely more carefully. As a result of scarcity, people and societies must make choices. Many of these choices are individual choices, but in the economy as a whole, some of the choices are left up to the government. So that's where the micro-macro distinction comes in. In micro, we look at those individual decisions made by individual people, which make up households. So decisions by households. And then we look at decisions by firms and how, the decisions they make. But when we get it all together, it becomes the big economy. And then sometimes the decisions of how the entire economy is going to work have to be made by the government because, again, like I said, animal spirits, sometimes things go a little bit wonky. All right, so second principle. So first one, again, choices are necessary because resources are scarce. The second principle, the true cost of something is its opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is what you must give up in order to get something. So choosing something always means not choosing something else. Sometimes the money you have to pay for something is a good indicator of its opportunity cost, but sometimes it's not. So let's say you wanted to miss an afternoon of work to go see a movie. Even if the ticket were free, you are still not getting paid the wages that you would get paid if you were at work. So you are bypassing this income that is also a cost. It's just not an explicit cost. It's what we term an implicit cost. And so that's what opportunity cost tries to capture. It tries to capture sort of this implicit cost that things have. Like if you're spending time doing something, that time could have been spent making money. So you have that implicit cost, and therefore the opportunity cost is both, at least in this case, it's both the price of the ticket and the wages that you miss from working. So again, not all costs are paid out of pocket. Some costs are funds that never reach your pocket. Third principle of individual choice: how much is a decision at the margin? So many choices are either or decisions. Should I vote for Hillary Clinton? Should I vote for Donald Trump? Should I go see the movie? Should I not? Other choices involve how much. How many slices of pizza should I eat? Um, do you want more pizza? Those kind of decisions. To decide how much, you have to weigh the cost against the benefits. So if you've eaten one slice of pizza, then that next slice of pizza may be a good idea. You're probably still hungry. But if you've eaten 35 slices of pizza, you may not want to eat that 36 slice pizza. Might be a bad idea at that point. Maybe that 35th one was a bad idea. Maybe the 30th was a bad idea. I'm just saying. So there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is defined as a comparison of the costs and benefits of doing something. Um, and then we look at, of course, marginal decisions. All decisions that we look at in economics are at sort of the margin, the edge of an activity. Formally defined, marginal decisions are decisions made at the margin of an activity about whether to do a bit more or a bit less of that activity. By looking at marginal decisions, we are engaging in what's called marginal analysis. And that's the study of marginal decisions. It's sort of one of the key characteristics of microeconomics and economics in general. So anytime we're studying decisions, we always study them at the margin, so we're always doing marginal analysis. And finally, the fourth principle of individual choice is that people usually respond to incentives. Therefore, they exploit opportunities to make themselves better off. So an incentive is anything that offers a reward to people who change their behavior. So when you try to predict how individuals will behave in economic situations, it's a very good bet that they will respond to incentives. That is, that they will exploit opportunities to make themselves better off. But sometimes those are unclear. That incentive is unclear. Like sometimes it's not clear what is the best option. And so that's what muddies the water of sort of predicting behavior. Now, in this context, when we say exploit opportunities to make themselves better off, we mean just to utilize. So we don't mean like a negative, pejorative definition of exploit. Individuals will continue to exploit opportunities until they have been fully exhausted. The principle that people will exploit opportunities to make themselves better off is the basis of all predictions by economists about individual behavior. So what you'll figure out in this class and also in the micro course is that we make assumptions about behavior, and they're simplifying assumptions, and they help us to understand things. Now, those simplifying assumptions are sometimes wrong, or maybe sometimes they're not painting the picture as clearly as they should be, and that's because the world is more complicated than we can paint a picture of. And so that's part of what also makes us the social science, is that there is often sort of debate about what the simplifying assumptions should be. Maybe we've made too many. Maybe we haven't made enough. And so in order to get to concrete conclusions, we make these decisions, but again, sometimes they're flawed, and any good economist will always acknowledge that. All right, let's talk about the next principles, dealing with interaction, how economies work. So we know an economy is a system for coordinating the productive activities of many people. In a market economy, coordination takes place without any coordinator. Each individual makes his or her own decisions and choices. Those choices are not independent of one another, though. So interaction, just formally defined here, of choices, in which my choices affect your choices and vice versa, is a feature of most economic situations, and the results of this interaction are often quite different from what individuals intend. So let's say if we're thinking about like agriculture and farming over the last century, farmers in the United States have eagerly adopted new farming techniques and crop strains that have resulted in lowering their costs and increasing their yields, which is great. Like they've made more money. But unfortunately, that resulted in like each farmer trying to increase his or her own income to the point where it's driven out many small farmers. So like the small farmers that aren't like these major like conglomerates that have like these industrialized processes for farming, like they just can't match the prices of those that do. And so they wind up going out of business. So in this case, the interactions have led to like this adverse byproduct, and that's a key characteristic of the economy. So just as there are 4 principles that underlie individual choice, there are 5 principles underlying the economics of interaction. The first one of these is that there are gains from trade. It benefits us to trade amongst each other. The next one, because people respond to incentives, then markets move toward what's called equilibrium. We'll talk about that more in a second. Resources should be used as efficiently as possible to achieve society's goals. Because people usually exploit gains from trade, markets usually lead to efficiency. And finally, when markets don't achieve efficiency, government intervention can improve society's welfare. So we'll talk about each of these in turn right now. First one, there are gains from trade. So the key to much better standards of living for everybody is trade. Trade, formally defined in a market economy, means that individuals engage in the behavior of providing goods and services to others and receive goods and services in return. The reason we have an economy and not just many self-sufficient individuals that make all their own food and all their own clothes and their shoes and everything is because there are gains from trade. Gains from trade, formally defined, means that people can get more of what they want through trade than they could if they tried to be self-sufficient. Gains from trade arise from this division of tasks, which economists call specialization. So Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations was the first to point out that specializing in a production process will allow you to produce a lot more. This guy Ricardo came up with this model of comparative advantage that we'll cover in chapter 3 that demonstrates that if people specialize in doing the thing that they're best at, meaning they have the lowest opportunity cost in, then overall you can produce a lot more, and then everybody gets a lot more out of that. And also, if you just think very simply, if you think about a lawyer doing the law stuff and a doctor doing the medical stuff, if they had to make their own clothes, if they each had to do the other person's job, and everybody else's job, obviously they couldn't do their jobs, and it would just be a big mess, and we just wouldn't get a lot done as a society. The economic growth that we've seen, the major advancements in our society are a result of us specializing and gaining from trade, which is why it's also a bad idea for us not to have trade pacts, and why Brexit is a bad idea, and why Donald Trump is dangerous, because if he decides that he doesn't want to trade with the rest of the world the way we are, then that could potentially result in a lot less being produced in the economy, both domestically and internationally, and that could be a problem. Now, trade is problematic as well. People are hurt by it, and that is always acknowledged, and none of these trade pacts are perfect, which is why people want to get away from them sometimes. But again, we don't live in a perfect world. We do the best we can sometimes, trying to coordinate 7 billion people and all the productive resources, etc. So specialization, specifically formally defined, is a situation in which each person specializes in the task that he or she is good at doing. The advantages of specialization, again, and the resulting gains from trade, were the starting point of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. All right, next principle, markets move toward equilibrium. So equilibrium is an economic situation in which no individual would be better off doing something different. So the phenomenon happens through price changes. So you have a bunch of buyers and a bunch of sellers. They interact in a market, and they get to what's called an equilibrium, where the market is sort of at peace, and everybody that can sell is selling, and everybody that can buy is buying at the price that the market sort of sets. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the market model. And price is the thing that sort of coordinates that. If you go beyond that equilibrium, then you can wind up hurting the market. You can wind up having mutually beneficial trades not occurring. If the price is too high, you're going to have people that would otherwise buy not be able to afford. If the price is too low, you're going to have producers that would otherwise produce that cannot produce at a low cost, not producing. So you'll have less being sold and bought in a market if you're outside of the equilibrium. We'll talk more about that when we actually get to the model. Some of these things will seem a little bit abstract today, and they're really not as complicated as they seem, because once you look at them in practice in a very simple model, it all becomes very clear. The fact that markets move toward equilibrium is why we can depend on them to work in such a predictable way. We can trust markets to supply us with the essentials of life. People who live in big cities can be sure that the supermarket shelves will always be fully stocked. If there isn't one company distributing all the various cereals that we all eat, basically General Mills or wherever it is, then somebody else is going to jump in and do it because everybody buys cereal. So like there's an opportunity to make profits there. If that opportunity exists, somebody's going to take it. If some merchants who distribute food didn't make deliveries, a big profit opportunity would be created for another merchant who did. All right, next principle, resources should be used efficiently to achieve society's goals. Now, efficient is one of those words that will be formally defined, even though you have an idea of what that word means. There's a formal definition in economics. An economy is efficient if it takes all opportunities to make some people better off without making other people worse off. That's what we mean by efficient. So that means that you're at the point where if somebody tries to be better off, then somebody's going to get hurt by that. But if you're inefficient, then you're in a situation where you can get to an efficient point by taking advantage of a situation that will benefit somebody without hurting somebody else. The efficient use of resources seems like it has something to do with money. In economics, money is only a means to other ends, though. So in the end, it is about like the goods that we produce and consume, and money is just sort of a way to facilitate our trading. The measure that economics really care about is not money, but people's happiness or welfare, which we term utility, which we'll talk about in later chapters. Economics say that an economy's resources are used efficiently when they are used in a way that has fully exploited all opportunities to make everybody better off. When an economy is efficient, it is producing the maximum gains from trade possible given the resources available. We'll talk about efficiency throughout the semester. Efficiency is a means to achieving society's goals. Sometimes efficiency may conflict with a goal that society has deemed worthwhile to achieve. In most societies, people also care about fairness, or what we term in economics equity. So when we're talking about equity, we're talking about fairness, a condition in which everyone gets his or her own fair share. The problem with that term is it's subjective. Like, what does fair mean? Fair to you may be different than what fair to me is. So it's just a hard thing to define, and that's why economics typically, in economics, first of all, there's a trade-off generally between equity and efficiency. But exactly how far policymakers go to sort of like mitigate the effects of trying to achieve efficiency in a market that may ultimately lead to a lack of equity is a difficult question that goes to the heart of the political process. So politics is the arena in which those decisions are decided, and the solutions are sort of generated in that area. And economics tries to stay away from trying to answer questions of equity. So in economics, we'll talk about efficiency, we'll talk about market failure, and sometimes the efficiency will be not equitable in like just a general view. But again, we're not about trying to figure out what's fair. We're about trying to figure out what's efficient. And then, you have other bodies and institutions in the world that sort of try to mitigate the effects of unbalancing our society in an unequitable way. All right, next principle, markets usually lead to efficiency. So the incentives built into a market economy ensure that resources are used, are put to good use, and that opportunities to make people better off are not wasted. The most basic reason is that in a market economy, people normally take opportunities for mutual gain. There are exceptions to this principle that markets are generally efficient. In the case of market failure, the individual pursuit of self-interest found in markets makes society worse off. The general rule is that markets are a remarkably good way of organizing an economy. Again, it's all about like acknowledging it's not perfect. We're not a perfect discipline, but overall, a lot of these things do work. If they didn't, we wouldn't be studying them. We wouldn't be advising policymakers on how they should be engaging the economy. All right, last principle of interaction and individual choice is that when markets don't achieve efficiency, that government intervention can improve society's welfare. So government intervention can take the form of taxes. It can take the form of price controls when when a government's like, we have to set a price high or low, regardless of what the market might want. Or the government could limit how much of something can be produced. So they could put like a quota on something and say, well, we can only produce this much of this. There's an entire branch of economics devoted to studying why markets fail and what policies should be adopted to improve social welfare. There are three principal ways in which markets fail. The first is that individual actions have side effects that are not properly taken into account by the market, like the air pollution and water pollution that I talked about earlier. That's one version of market failure. Another one involves like one party preventing mutually beneficial trades from occurring in an attempt to capture a greater share of resources for itself. So you'll have like monopolists and that's an extreme example where you have a market that's run by only one producer, and then that producer essentially has complete control of the market and can set whatever price they want. But because they usually will set a higher price in order to get higher profits, that means that people go without buying certain things that otherwise would buy things if the market were allowed to equilibrate on its own. And so that's one of the ways that the market can fail. And finally, the third way is that some goods by their very nature are unsuited for efficient management by markets. So if you think about like natural resources or like rivers with fishing and like lands for farming, like those things, like sometimes you have to sort of like regulate them in order for them to not to be overexploited and ultimately laid waste. An important part of your education in economics is to learn to identify not just when markets won't work, but also when not just when the markets work, but also when they won't work, and to judge what government policies are appropriate in each situation. So this class will slightly touch upon the micro stuff, but definitely in the macro arena, all of the stuff we're going to be talking about leads directly to a set of like principles that the government uses to try to regulate the economy in order to stabilize it. Because if you go back to like 1930, when we had like the Great Depression, there was this huge stock market crash in 1929 that led to like 10 years of like misery in this country, the Great Depression. During that time, we didn't have a discipline called macroeconomics, and this guy, John Maynard Keynes, this British economist, actually kind of like sat down and wrote down like a lot of the principles that you'll see in the book that we have today that a lot of the central banks follow, in which it became evident that the government needs to start spending money when the economy slows down dramatically in order to boost the economy again, in order to get it going again. And that was like a very unpopular idea before that period, but that period demonstrated that it actually works. And then, of course, whenever you have war, you have a lot of government spending, and we had World War II that started in 1941, and that is often said to be like the actual end of the Great Depression, because government spending just skyrocketed at that point. And then if you look now to like 2008, the Great Recession, that could have been a depression. But all these bailouts and all this spending that the government did actually curtailed the ability of us to sort of plunge into that sort of despair type of long period of time that we could have plunged into. And again, that reflects us understanding the fact that markets and market economies need government intervention. And this class is going to be a lot about that. So let's talk specifically about like the principles that underlie economy-wide interactions, the big movements, which ultimately will underlie everything that we talk about in the majority of this course. So to understand the economy as a whole, its ups and downs, recessions and recoveries, we need to understand economy-wide interactions. Understanding the big picture of the economy requires three more economic principles. The first one is that one person's spending is another person's income. So that's just the way an economy works. Like if you're spending money, somebody is making that as their income. When you are working for somebody, you are selling your labor to them, and they are paying you. So they're buying from you your labor, and that is then becoming your income. So if we just look at just a domestic economy, it's a closed system. When you look at the international economy, like various individual like country economies interacting, you're going to get money coming in and out. But overall, like it's going to like stay constant as far as like how much there is in there, unless unless money is being created by a central bank, which is something we'll talk about later in the chapter and later in the course, much later in the course. Okay, overall spending sometimes gets out of line with the economy's productive capacity. That's another principle that's important. Sometimes, like, we're spending too much or we're not spending enough, and there's too much being made or not enough being made, and that will definitely have a big impact on the ups and downs of our economy. We'll talk about that in fine detail. Government policies can change spending is the final principle. Again, it's about understanding that the economy itself cannot exist and cannot function in a balanced way without government intervention. So let's just talk about these last three principles in a little bit more detail, and then we'll be done for the day. One person's spending is another person's income. I already covered that one. It's pretty simple. It's pretty self-explanatory. Second principle, overall spending sometimes gets out of line with the economy's productive capacity. So macroeconomics emerged as a separate branch of economics in the 1930s when a collapse of consumer and business spending, a crisis in the banking industry, and other factors led to a plunge in overall spending. We, of course, know it to be the Great Depression. In the 1930s, spending fell far short of what we needed to keep American workers employed, and the result was a severe economic slump. But it's also possible for spending to get too high, and when that happens, prices start to get really high throughout the entire economy, and that's what we call inflation. In that case, the economy experiences inflation, a rise in prices throughout the economy. This rise in prices occurs because when the amount that people want to buy outstrips the supply, producers can raise their prices and still find willing customers. So there's like this balancing act in the that the government sort of is always playing, trying to like not let the economy get too like sort of accelerated and get prices too high and therefore have inflation. So they're always kind of trying to rein that in. But the other side of the coin is that if you try to slow down the economy, then you'll have unemployment. You don't want too much unemployment because then that slows down the economy. So that's what central banks are always trying to do, is trying to like kind of balance those two things. And we're going to talk a lot about that in this course. So ultimately, government policies can change spending. The government itself does a lot of spending on everything from military equipment to education. The government can also vary how much it collects from the public in taxes, which in turn affect how much income consumers and businesses have left to spend. So if they want the economy to accelerate a bit, they can cut taxes or they can spend themselves. The government's control of the quantity of money in circulation, it turns out, also gives it another powerful tool with which to affect total spending. So we'll talk about in fine detail how that works, how governments create money. It's complicated, but it's super important for you to understand, so you understand this very important part of our world that affects all of us. We all have money. We all are affected by the value of that money. And so the more you understand that, the better, the more confident just a citizen you'll be. Government spending, taxes, and the control of money are the tools of macroeconomic policy. And so, again, that is going to be the central focus of this course. We're going to learn a lot about that, and it's going to be exciting. You're going to love it. All right, we're done for the day. Have a great night. I'll see you guys next Tuesday, and I'll keep you updated on this textbook catastrophe that we are facing.